Between March and October of 1827, 3 young women slipped out of Charleston society without a trace. Daughters of the same respected minister, their disappearances were politely explained away. Official records claimed each had married and moved north, but no marriage certificates were ever filed, no witnesses ever came forward, and by December that year, the county courthouse burned to the ground, taking with it whatever proof might have remained. Historians would later uncover something else. In that same year, Reverend Josiah Pendleton, a country pastor earning less than $30 a year, managed to settle gambling debts exceeding $12,000. 4 of the wealthiest men in the Low Country, his creditors, never spoke of how those debts were cleared. The silence around it lasted nearly 80 years, broken only by a dying woman's confession that dragged the secret back into the light. What happened in that quiet parish outside Charleston was not a tale of faith, but of desperation, corruption, and the price of silence. The truth, when it finally surfaced, was far darker than anyone imagined. It began with 4 men who understood power better than God, and with a reverend who found himself bound to them by chains of his own making. St. James Parish lay 12 miles northwest of Charleston, a stretch of Carolina low country where cotton fields blurred into pine forest and the Santee River cut through like a dark vein. In 1825 it held perhaps 300 souls, most of them enslaved workers spread across scattered plantations. The white population was small, planters, merchants, a doctor, and families clinging to the thin veneer of civility that passed for grace in a world built on cruelty. Reputation was everything there, and every neighbor pretended to know every secret, though most of them knew only half. On a slight hill above the river stood the chapel, whitewashed every spring, its bell tower visible for miles. Josiah Pendleton had preached there since 1814, arriving from Virginia with his young wife Sarah and their infant daughter Catherine. He was 28 then, tall and self-assured, a man with a powerful voice and an even stronger conviction that his words mattered. His sermons offered comfort to the plantation class, the kind of Christianity that wrapped sin in gentility and called it forgiveness. By the time 11 years had passed, the Pendletons had 3 daughters. Catherine, the eldest, serious and sharp-eyed, carried her father's dark gaze and a quiet strength that made people uneasy. Mary, a year younger, had her mother's pale hair and a voice that could turn hymns into something almost holy. Abigail, the youngest, was quick-minded, curious, educated far beyond what was expected of a young woman in those days. Her father had taught her Latin and numbers, believing those skills might help her marry into comfort, though he himself could not afford it. The family lived beside the chapel in a 2-story home of modest respectability. There was a parlor for guests, a dining room for family suppers, and upstairs bedrooms that stayed cool even when the Carolina air turned heavy with heat. Sarah tended a small garden behind the house, while 2 enslaved servants kept the household running. Jacob, who cared for the chapel grounds, and Dinah, who cooked, cleaned, and quietly knew more about the Pendleton family than anyone else alive. From the outside, it was a picture of good Christian living. Inside, something was beginning to rot. It began with cards. Sunday evenings at Charles Drayton's plantation had started as friendly gatherings among men of standing. There was whiskey, conversation, and the French card game that had become fashionable in Charleston, 21. The bets were harmless at first, the kind of sums that a minister could lose with dignity, but gambling has a way of turning fellowship into hunger, and Josiah Pendleton carried that hunger like a fever. When he won, he chased more. When he lost, he convinced himself the next hand would turn his fortune. By the spring of 1826, he owed Charles Drayton $800. Judge Thaddeus Calhoun $400 more, Dr. Silas Pritchard $600, and the merchant Edmund Rutledge over $2,000. In total, more than $6,000. an impossible figure for a man of faith whose salary barely kept bread on the table. The men were patient at first, watching him struggle. A debtor could be controlled, and control was their true currency. Together, they formed what would later be known as the Circle, though in their time it had no name, only an understanding. Each man held power over his corner of the world. Drayton over the land, Calhoun over the law, Pritchard over the body, and Rutledge over the coin. They shared information, bartered favors, and used those beneath them as pawns. When someone stumbled, they offered a hand that lifted him just high enough to hang himself. In January of 1827, the Circle decided it was time for collection. They met in a back room of Rutledge's store, door locked, brandy bottle half gone. Reverend Pendleton came expecting mercy, perhaps a new payment plan, a small miracle. Instead, Drayton pushed across a sheet of paper listing every debt, every wager, every dollar lost to pride. With interest, the total had grown to 6,000. The number stared up at him like a judgment. He tried to plead. He spoke of his brother in Virginia, of selling his home, of finding some way. They listened in silence until Calhoun reminded him that the house belonged to the church, and his brother was a poor schoolteacher. Drayton leaned forward, voice smooth as honey over poison, and explained there was another way. The Reverend had 3 daughters, unmarried, lovely, each worth a fortune in purity and reputation. The offer was simple: deliver them to the men who could provide for them, and the debts would vanish. There would be no ceremony, no witnesses, only discretion and forgiveness. For a long time, Pendleton couldn't speak. The words twisted inside him, each one cutting deeper than the last. When he finally rose, the chair crashed behind him, the sound loud enough to startle even the men who thought they owned him. They called it an opportunity. He called it damnation. They gave him 2 weeks. Catherine first, because she was eldest, and it was proper. That night, Josiah walked the river road alone, boots cracking frozen mud, breath ghosting in the January air. The moon was bright enough to cast the trees into long shadows, thin and skeletal against the sky. He thought of running west, of packing the family into a wagon and disappearing beyond the mountains. But he had no money for the journey, and the roads were treacherous that time of year. He thought of confession, of throwing himself on his wife's mercy, but what mercy could save them? And who in Charleston's courts would stand against men like Drayton or Calhoun? By dawn, he was on his knees at the riverbank, praying to a God who no longer seemed to listen. The verses he had preached for years felt empty now, their promises hollow. He went home as the sun rose and found Sarah in the kitchen, flour dusting her hands, the smell of bread still warm in the air. She saw the mud on his clothes and the vacancy in his eyes, and knew something inside him had broken. In his study, he told her of arrangements, of marriages to good and generous men. She listened in silence until the names came out: Drayton, Rutledge, Pritchard, and then silence became horror. The truth fell between them like a curse. He tried to justify it: debts, ruin, the loss of everything they had built. She accused him of selling their daughters, and he denied it with the same trembling conviction that had once fueled his sermons. It was salvation, not sale, protection, not betrayal. But even as the words left his mouth, he no longer believed them. Sarah saw it clearly: the desperation, the weakness, the way fear had hollowed him out until nothing remained but pride. She refused to help. He reminded her of obedience, of duty, of the hunger waiting beyond their door if she defied him. She looked at him as if he were a stranger wearing her husband's face. Over the next 2 weeks, Josiah worked alone. He spoke to each daughter separately, weaving tales of opportunity and honor. Catherine, the eldest, saw through him first. Her eyes, dark like his, held no softness. She listened, hands folded, expression still, and asked what kind of marriage began in secrecy. He tried to answer but couldn't. Catherine refused, and for the first time Josiah felt the full weight of what he had become. She saw it too, the cowardice masquerading as sacrifice. Her final words cut deeper than any scripture he had ever preached. On the night of February 14th, 1827, the Reverend loaded the family wagon under a cold, brittle sky. Frost clung to the bare branches, the lantern light flickering over the ruts in the road. Catherine sat beside him, silent, her face pale beneath her cloak. The wheels creaked through the darkness until the Drayton plantation loomed ahead, its great house standing like a shadow against the stars. Charles Drayton waited on the porch, whiskey glass in hand, dressed for the occasion as if sin required formality. He greeted them with polished courtesy, took Catherine's arm with the confidence of ownership. Josiah handed over a small bag, her clothes, her books, the Bible her mother had given her as a child. Drayton slipped a folded paper from his coat, $2,000, debt-marked, paid in full. The Reverend's hands shook as he took it. He tried to look at his daughter, to find something, anger, forgiveness, anything, but she was already walking toward the door. The light swallowed her, and the door closed with a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 3 days after Catherine vanished into the Drayton plantation, a carriage stopped without warning at the Pendleton home. The driver stayed silent while the passenger stepped down, a thin woman wrapped in a shawl despite the warm air. Margaret Drayton's face was pale, her eyes rimmed red, the expression of someone who had spent nights without sleep. Sarah Pendleton opened the door and felt dread rise before a word was spoken. Margaret's voice trembled, raw from crying. She demanded to see the Reverend. Josiah appeared from his study, startled to find the wife of Charles Drayton on his porch. She pushed past him into the hall, her composure unraveling. She wanted to know where Catherine was. The girl who had been delivered to her home 3 nights earlier had disappeared. Her husband insisted Catherine had run away, but Margaret had searched every room, questioned every servant, every field hand. Catherine's belongings were still there, her cloak by the door, her Bible on the table. No girl ran into a February night without a cloak. Sarah's hands went cold. Josiah tried to reason, muttering that perhaps Catherine had left of her own will, but Margaret's laugh cut through the house like breaking glass. She knew better. She had lived with Charles Drayton for 26 years and understood the darkness inside him. She had seen what he did to the enslaved girls on the plantation when he thought she wasn't watching. Something terrible had happened in that house, and the Reverend had delivered his daughter to it. Sarah demanded the truth. Margaret lowered her voice to a near whisper, glancing toward the windows as if the very air might be listening. The servants had heard screams the first night from the East Wing, where Charles had taken Catherine. Hours of it, then silence. In the morning there was blood on the floor, a trail leading down the back stairs before it was scrubbed clean. The maid who told her had been ordered never to speak of it again. Sarah felt the room tilt. Margaret Drayton's words came faster now, spilling out before courage failed her. When she confronted her husband, he threatened to have her declared hysterical and sent to the asylum in Charleston. He promised to ruin her if she breathed a word. She was leaving now, she said, fleeing to Savannah to live with her sister. But before she went, she had something the Pendletons needed to see. From her reticule she drew a folded letter, its paper creased and smudged. She had found it hidden under Catherine's mattress. The handwriting was careful, the ink blurred where tears had fallen. It was addressed to her mother. Sarah unfolded the page, her hands trembling. Catherine had written that if the letter was found, she was already gone. She knew what was coming, that her father had sold her for $2,000 and that Charles Drayton would never let her leave. She was not afraid of dying, only of what might come before death, the pain, the violation, the loss of herself. She begged her mother to forgive her father's weakness and to protect her sisters from the same fate. Sarah read the words twice, the air leaving her lungs with each line. She whispered that Catherine had known. Josiah tried to argue, muttering that perhaps she had run away, that there was still hope. Sarah turned on him then, fury shaking her voice. She accused him of killing their daughter with his cowardice. Margaret Drayton said quietly that everyone already knew what kind of man Charles Drayton was. The difference this time was that Catherine Pendleton was white, educated, a reverend's daughter. The circle had gone too far. Sarah wanted to go to the authorities, but Margaret's laugh came bitter and hollow. The authorities were the circle, Calhoun the judge, the sheriff on their payroll, the doctor who erased their sins. To accuse them was to invite ruin. The only choice left was to protect the daughters who remained. "Do not send Mary to Rutledge," she pleaded. "Do not send Abigail to Pritchard. Run if you must. Let them take everything else, but not the girls." She turned to leave, her carriage waiting at the gate. She said she was sorry for what had happened to Catherine, sorry she could not have stopped it. But she was a woman in a man's world with no power of her own. Then she was gone down the road toward Charleston, leaving silence behind her. Sarah stood in the doorway clutching the letter while Josiah stared at the floor. She wanted to search the plantation, to tear through the woods and riverbanks until she found her daughter, but Josiah's voice stopped her. They would do nothing. If they accused Charles Drayton, the circle would destroy them all, take Mary and Abigail as punishment. Better to keep quiet, better to survive. Sarah looked at him and saw only fear. He told himself he was protecting what remained, but she knew he was only protecting himself, his title, his name, the last scraps of respect he had left. And so he did what frightened men do. He clung to the lie. Within days, word spread that Catherine Pendleton had married Charles Drayton in a private ceremony. Josiah accepted congratulations with a hollow smile. He nodded when people praised the advantageous match, dodged questions about why no one had attended the wedding or seen the bride since. He became a partner in his daughter's disappearance through silence. Sarah could not bear it. She withdrew from the church, claiming illness. She barely spoke to her husband, spending hours alone in Catherine's room, reading and rereading the letter, staring out the window as if her daughter might appear on the road. The servants watched her unravel, whispering prayers they no longer believed would be answered. Rain came to the low country in March, cold and unending, turning fields to swamp. Josiah marked the passing weeks with dread. Edmund Rutledge would soon come to collect his payment. Mary would be next, she already knew. One morning she found the letter on the kitchen table where her mother had left it by mistake. She read it 3 times before folding it carefully and hiding it close to her heart. Unlike Catherine, she did not argue with her father. She began preparing quietly for what she knew was coming. Mary stopped eating with the family, grew thinner, and took long walks into the pine forest where no one could follow. She spent hours in the kitchen with Dinah, asking questions about herbs, what healed and what harmed, which roots brought sleep, which stopped a heart. Dinah had seen too much in her lifetime not to recognize the purpose behind those questions. The older woman tried to warn her. Those herbs were dangerous, meant for women desperate to end what should never have begun. Mary listened, calm and determined, saying she was not yet with child, but expected to be soon. Her father would send her to Rutledge, and she would not let that man own even a piece of her. She wanted a way to make sure of it. Dinah hesitated, torn between fear and pity. Helping could mean her death if anyone found out, but refusing might drive Mary to poison herself blindly. So she agreed, teaching the girl how to gather the plants properly, tansy and pennyroyal, black cohosh and cotton root, how to brew them into tea strong enough to purge the body. She warned her to be careful, to use only what she was told. Too much could kill outright. Too little could bring agony that lasted days. Mary promised to be careful, thanked her softly, and hid the wrapped bundle of herbs beneath her clothes. Dinah told her not to thank her yet, just to stay alive. On March 23, 1827, Edmund Rutledge arrived to claim what was owed. He came in a fine carriage drawn by black horses, dressed like a man who believed respectability could disguise rot. Josiah met him on the porch, hands shaking. Rutledge produced the document marking $2,000 paid upon delivery. There was nothing left to discuss. Mary was already waiting upstairs, a small bag packed. Her face was calm, too calm, the serenity of someone who had already accepted her fate. She looked at her father once, asked if he felt any shame. His answer was a silence heavy with excuses. She called him what he was, a coward, and walked past him out into the grey afternoon. Her mother stood in the doorway, lips pressed white, unable to speak. Rutledge helped Mary into the carriage with a touch that lingered too long, a gesture that made Sarah flinch. The horses started forward, wheels sinking into the muddy road until the carriage disappeared among the trees. Another daughter gone, another debt marked paid. Josiah stood on the porch with the paper in his hands, the word coward echoing through his skull like a bell tolling the hour of judgment. Behind him, Sarah made a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a sob, then turned away without looking back. What happened next in Rutledge's grand house would make the horror complete, but for that moment only the rain bore witness. Cold, relentless, and without mercy. The Rutledge home stood on the edge of Charleston like a monument to arrogance. 3 stories of red brick and white columns, its gardens overgrown and half dead. The kind of grandeur that tried too hard to convince the world it was still alive. Inside, the air carried the scent of dust, candle smoke, and something sour beneath. An odor that clung to the walls like guilt. Mary Pendleton was given a room on the 2nd floor, at the far end of a long corridor that smelled of wax and decay. The bed was soft, the curtains heavy, the window facing a garden that had long since surrendered to weeds. It might have been a sanctuary, but the locked door made it a cell. Rutledge let her settle, leaving her alone for hours that first day. The silence pressed against her until even the creak of floorboards felt like a threat. She understood her situation completely. She was property now, purchased for a price. Her father's sins had made her currency, and the man who owned her would collect his due. That night, she heard his footsteps coming down the hall, slow and deliberate, the measured rhythm of a man who had no reason to hurry. She stood by the window, clutching the small letter opener she had taken from the desk. The handle felt cold against her skin. When the key turned in the lock, her heart was steady. He found her standing there, back straight, the blade at her throat. The sight amused him. He moved closer, confident, until she pressed the metal hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. The amusement faded. There was a tense silence thick enough to choke on. She told him without words that death would be easier than what he planned. He believed her, for that night he left. But morning would come, and with it the knowledge that the reprieve was temporary. She refused the breakfast his wife brought, the bread untouched, the tea poured into the chamber pot once the woman left. Constance Rutledge was thin, fragile, her eyes darting like those of a bird that had spent too long in a cage. She knew why the girl was there, but lacked the courage to intervene. Years of fear had worn her into obedience. Survival had replaced conscience. By the second night, the pretense of civility ended. The key turned again, and the man who entered did not ask. The struggle lasted minutes, the damage forever. When it was over, he straightened his clothes, muttered that she would learn acceptance, and left her on the bed staring into the dark. She lay there until her body stopped shaking. The world around her blurred. In the faint light from the hearth, she found the bundle of herbs Dinah had given her. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, boiling water, steeping the leaves until the air filled with the bitter scent of medicine and death. She drank every drop. The pain came fast, cramps like knives, waves that stole her breath. She bit down on the pillow to keep from crying out. When dawn came, she was soaked in blood and sweat, her limbs weak, her body failing. She knew she had taken too much. Constance found her that morning, pale as linen, lips cracked and dry. The older woman froze for a moment, then shouted for help. Servants came running, their faces masks of fear. They carried the girl to another room, cleaned the bed, tried to stop the bleeding with rags that turned red within minutes. Someone whispered for a doctor. Constance forbade it. No doctors, especially not Pritchard. They would handle this themselves. For 3 days, Mary drifted between fever and oblivion. Constance stayed beside her, cooling her forehead, whispering prayers she no longer believed in. The bleeding slowed, but the fever burned hotter. She spoke in fragments, dreaming aloud of her sister, of the river, of screams in the dark. When Rutledge learned what had happened, his rage shook the house. He stormed through the hallways, shouting about ruined goods, about money wasted. Constance faced him with quiet fury, telling him to let the girl recover and send her home. He sneered that she was damaged now, useless, but that he could not release her without suspicion. So Mary stayed locked away like a secret too dangerous to discard. Weeks passed. The fever broke but left her hollow. She refused to speak, refused to eat unless forced. Constance continued to care for her, driven by guilt and something like pity. Whatever strength Mary had left was being consumed from within. Back in St. James Parish, the Pendleton house had grown silent except for the sound of madness. Sarah no longer slept in her own bed. She spent her nights in Catherine's room, setting a place at the table for a daughter who would never return, speaking softly to the empty air. Dinah and Jacob exchanged worried glances but said nothing. Josiah ignored it all, lost in the rituals of denial, writing sermons no one wanted to hear, preaching to a congregation that was already whispering behind his back. Abigail watched both parents crumble. At 18, she had her mother's resolve, but her father's intellect sharpened by disillusionment. She saw the truth too clearly to pretend. Her mother was slipping into grief beyond recovery. Her father was rotting from shame and fear, and she was next. The circle was patient, but not forever. Dr. Pritchard would soon come for his payment, expecting the youngest daughter to complete the transaction. Josiah avoided the subject as long as he could, but the weight of his debts pressed closer each day. When he finally admitted that Pritchard was asking questions, Abigail looked at him not with fear, but with a kind of cold contempt. She told him there would be no third daughter sacrificed. Let the doctor take the house, the books, the pulpit, everything but her. She would rather die than follow her sisters into that darkness. Josiah called her dramatic, but she only smiled, a bitter, knowing smile that made him falter. While her father clung to the illusion of control, Abigail was building something quietly behind the scenes. She'd been speaking to people, the enslaved, the servants, the women whose lives circled the edges of power. They had seen and heard things the men of the circle believed would stay buried. She was gathering their stories, collecting evidence piece by piece. Letters, documents, whispered confessions. She knew about Catherine's letter and Mary's suffering, and she began to see the pattern, the way power hid its crimes behind respectability. She sent word to Margaret Drayton, now dying in Savannah, who answered with a written testimony describing the screams, the blood, and the trail of dead girls before Catherine. Margaret had nothing left to lose. Her account named names. Abigail reached even further, to Charleston itself, where a young journalist named Thomas Brennan wrote for a reformist paper called the Southern Patriot. He had the kind of reckless ambition that often passes for courage. At first he doubted her story, Then she laid the evidence before him. The letters, the patterns of debt and silence, the testimony of women nobody else had listened to. His skepticism dissolved into grim fascination. They met in secret, piecing together the web of corruption. Abigail knew every step was dangerous, that the circle had eyes everywhere, but the truth had become the only thing that mattered. If she fell, she would fall pulling them down with her. By early May, the story was ready. It was more than gossip now. It was documentation, signatures, testimony, enough to light a fire under the most arrogant men in Charleston. But the circle had been watching. One afternoon, Dr. Pritchard arrived at the Pendleton house carrying his medical bag, his face composed into professional concern. He claimed he had come to check on Sarah, who everyone knew had taken ill. Josiah hesitated but allowed him in. What harm could a doctor do that hadn't already been done? Pritchard spent 20 minutes alone in the upstairs room. When he emerged, he carried an empty vial and spoke of melancholia, of restlessness, of the need for calm. He had given her a sedative, he said, something to help her rest. He would return in the morning to check her progress. 2 hours later, Sarah began to convulse. Dinah found her thrashing on the bed, foam on her lips, eyes rolled white. The fits lasted 15 minutes and then stopped. Her breathing came shallow, her skin grey. Dinah saw it immediately. Whatever she had been given was poison. There was no saving her. By sunset, Sarah Pendleton was dead. The official cause, heart failure brought on by melancholia. No autopsy, no questions. Abigail understood. The circle was cleaning up its loose ends. Her mother had been named in Margaret Drayton's statement. Silence was the only cure they believed in. The funeral was small. A pitiful crowd gathered under a grey sky. Judge Calhoun himself delivered the eulogy, his voice soft, his words sweet enough to curdle. Abigail stood beside her father, who stared at the ground as if afraid to meet her eyes. When the coffin was lowered, something inside her hardened. That night she met Brennan in a tavern on the outskirts of Charleston. The smell of ale and smoke thickened the air, the room half empty. She told him about the vial, about the sudden illness, about the way Pritchard had walked out of the house unchallenged. He listened without interruption, then told her what she already knew. They had to move fast. If the circle was killing witnesses, the story needed to go to print before there was no one left to tell it. Abigail hesitated only once, thinking of Mary still locked in that house of horrors. Publishing might doom her, but then she thought of Catherine, of her mother, of every woman swallowed by the silence of men like Drayton and Rutledge. She decided that if Mary's death could break the circle, then it would not be in vain.